George had always prided himself on the life he had built. He worked tirelessly to provide for his family, ensuring that Mary, his wife, and their daughter, Lily, wanted for nothing. Their home was a cozy haven, filled with laughter, love, and the scent of Mary's home-cooked meals. On weekends, they would go on family outings, enjoying picnics in the park or watching Lily's soccer games. Friends and neighbors often commented on how perfect their family seemed, a sentiment that filled George with quiet satisfaction. Suddenly, George began to notice subtle changes in Mary's behavior. Mary, who was once attentive and affectionate, seemed to withdraw into herself. She spent more time on her phone, often smiling at messages and giggling softly. George, though slightly concerned, brushed it off. One evening, as George was preparing dinner, he noticed that Mary had left her phone on the kitchen counter. She was in the living room, engrossed in a conversation with Lily. George, feeling a pang of curiosity, glanced at the phone. He saw a series of messages from an unknown number, filled with suggestive comments and heart emojis. His heart began to race, but he quickly chastised himself for being paranoid. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, George went back to the kitchen to clean up. As he washed the dishes, he heard Mary's voice, low and conspiratorial. She was in the adjacent room, speaking on the phone. George paused, straining to hear the conversation. "I can't wait to try your huge Johnson again, 'cause my hubby's one is half the size. So boring." The plate slipped from George's hands, shattering on the floor. He stood frozen, the cold sweat of betrayal breaking out across his forehead. The words echoed in his mind, each one a dagger to his heart. His legs felt like jelly as he leaned against the counter for support. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. Mary, his Mary, was talking about another man with such familiarity and intimacy. "Honey, what's happened?" "Nothing. I can manage this," he said, his voice steady. For a moment, he considered confronting her right then and there, demanding answers. But the raw anger and hurt that surged through him made him realize he needed more than just words. He needed proof, undeniable evidence of her betrayal. He had to catch her red-handed. Determined, George formulated a plan. The following morning, George carried out his plan with a heavy heart and steely determination. He dressed in his usual work attire and kissed Mary on the cheek, feigning normalcy. Her smile seemed sweeter, her eyes brighter, and for a brief moment, he almost doubted his suspicions. But the memory of her words from the previous night steeled his resolve. He needed to see this through. George left the house, driving his car a few blocks away before doubling back on foot. He found a hidden vantage point where he could observe their home. After what felt like an eternity, Mary finally emerged. She glanced around nervously before getting into her car and driving away. George followed at a safe distance, his heart pounding in his chest. Mary drove across town, heading towards the outskirts where a high-end hotel stood in stark contrast to its surroundings. She parked in a secluded spot, hidden from prying eyes. George parked his car a few rows behind, watching intently. His breath caught in his throat as he saw her step out of the car, her face lighting up as she spotted a man waiting for her. From his vantage point, James saw Mary meet a man. The two of them exchanged a quick embrace before heading to the elevator. James's vision blurred with rage as he recognized the man, Donald, a well-known politician with a reputation for charm and scandal. Donald was everything George was not: charismatic, powerful, and with a reputation for charm that had made him a household name. On the other hand, he is only a filthy rich old fart. As the politician enveloped Mary in a passionate kiss, George's vision blurred with a mix of rage and heartbreak. He fumbled for his phone, capturing several photos of their intimate embrace. Each click of the shutter was a stab to his heart, but it was also evidence, the irrefutable proof he needed. George watched as Mary and Donald entered the hotel, their hands intertwined. He waited until they disappeared inside before making his move. His mind was a whirl of emotions, but he focused on the task at hand. He approached the hotel entrance with a purposeful stride, his eyes scanning the lobby. He needed access to a room adjacent to theirs, and he needed it fast. Spotting a young staff member, George slipped him a generous tip. "I need a favor," he said, his voice steady. I need to get into the room number 304 and a room next to that one. My wife and her friend just entered. The staff member hesitated, but the sight of the cash convinced him. Moments later, George was inside the adjacent room, his heart pounding as he set up a hidden camera. He watched the feed from his phone, waiting for the right moment. The image of Mary and Donald, entwined and oblivious, filled the screen. Rage bubbled within him, but he held it in check. He needed more than just photos. He needed undeniable evidence of their betrayal. When he had enough footage, George burst into the room, his eyes blazing with fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared. Mary and Donald scrambled, their faces pale with shock. They tried to cover their naked bodies themselves, but George was relentless. "George," Mary gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "What are you doing here? Bitch, you thought you could cheat on me and get away with it?" He spat, his voice cold. He struck Mary across the face, the sound of the impact echoing in the room. "You thought I was so boring, Mary? Let's see how exciting this is." Mary cried out, but George was beyond hearing her pleas. He grabbed a length of rope from his bag, tying them both up with a precision born of rage. They struggled, but George was relentless, his mind focused on his need for justice. Their protests were a distant buzz in his ears as he secured them to the bedposts. "You've humiliated me," George said, his voice trembling with emotion. "In front of our daughter, our friends, everyone. Now, you'll see what it feels like." Donald tried to reason with him, his voice shaky. "George, please, let's talk about this. We can come to an understanding." George laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "An understanding? You took my wife, and you want an understanding?" He leaned in close, his face inches from Donald's. "The only thing you'll understand is that there are consequences for your actions." Mary sobbed, her tears flowing freely. "George, I'm sorry. Please, don't do this. We can fix this. We can go back to how things were." George shook his head, his eyes cold. "There's no going back, Mary. You made your choice. Now, you'll face the consequences." The room was thick with tension, the air almost tangible with fear and desperation. Mary and Donald were bound to the bedposts, their eyes wide with terror as George loomed over them. The shock of the situation rendered them silent at first, but as the reality set in, their pleas began to spill out. "George, please, let us go," Mary begged, her voice breaking. "We can talk about this. Please, just untie us." Donald tried to maintain his composure, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "You don't want to do this, George. Think about the consequences." George stared at them, his expression a mask of cold fury. "Consequences?" he echoed. "You should have thought about that before you decided to betray me." Ignoring their continued pleas, George pulled out his phone and began taking photos. He moved methodically, capturing every angle, every expression of fear and humiliation. The camera clicked repeatedly, each flash of light highlighting their vulnerability. "Please, George," Mary sobbed. "This isn't you. Don't do this." George's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the focus, but he pushed aside any remnants of pity or hesitation. "You'll regret ever betraying me," he said coldly. "Both of you." Donald's composure cracked further. "George, I'm a public figure. These photos, they'll ruin me. Think about what you're doing." George paused, his gaze hardening. "You should have thought about that before you decided to seduce my wife," he replied. "You both brought this on yourselves." He snapped more photos, ensuring he captured their faces in various states of distress. Mary's tear-streaked face, Donald's fear-stricken eyes, the intimate, compromising position they were in, it was all documented. George knew these images would be devastating. They were a weapon, one that would not just hurt but obliterate their lives as they knew them. When he was satisfied with his collection of photos, George took a step back, surveying his work. Mary was openly crying now, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Donald had closed his eyes, a look of resigned despair on his face. George felt a grim satisfaction settle over him. They were finally experiencing a fraction of the pain they had inflicted on him. With his task completed, George knew he had to leave. The longer he stayed, the greater the risk of being discovered. He gathered his belongings, including the hidden camera, ensuring there was no trace of his presence. Before he left, he turned to face them one last time. "I hope this was worth it," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You've destroyed our family, but now you get to live with the consequences of your actions." Mary's sobs intensified, her pleas becoming more desperate. "George, please, don't leave us like this. Please, I'm begging you." Donald looked at George with a mix of anger and fear. "You'll pay for this," he said through gritted teeth. "You won't get away with it." George simply shook his head. "I already have." He walked out of the room, the door closing behind him with a definitive click. As he made his way through the hotel, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone he passed. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, but he pushed the thoughts away. There would be time to process everything later. Once outside, George took a deep breath, the cool air a stark contrast to the suffocating tension of the hotel room. He got into his car and drove away, his mind racing. The images he had captured were powerful, but they were just the beginning. He had set the wheels of his plan in motion, and now there was no turning back. As he drove home, a mixture of emotions churned within him. The satisfaction of revenge was tempered by a deep sadness. His marriage, once a source of pride and joy, was in ruins. The woman he had loved and trusted had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and in seeking revenge, he had crossed a line, becoming someone he barely recognized. But amidst the turmoil, one thought kept him going: justice. He had been wronged, and now it was time for the world to see the truth. He pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his home offering a brief moment of comfort. He sat in the car for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before finally heading inside. Inside, the house was quiet. Lily was staying with a friend for the weekend, a small mercy given the chaos that had unfolded. George went to his study and locked the door. He transferred the photos from his phone to his computer, backing them up multiple times. Each image was a piece of his shattered heart, but also a testament to his resolve. As he stared at the screen, he knew there was no going back. He had taken control, and now he had to see it through to the end. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was prepared. This was just the beginning of his quest for justice and revenge. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting an eerie calm over George's study. He sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen filled with the incriminating photos of Mary and Donald. He knew that once he hit send, there would be no turning back. The thought of exposing their betrayal to the world filled him with a grim satisfaction, but also a lingering doubt. He pushed it aside, focusing on his goal: justice. Taking a deep breath, George composed an email to various media outlets, attaching the damning photos. He crafted a message highlighting the hypocrisy and moral failings of Donald, a politician who had built his career on a facade of integrity. He double-checked everything, making sure no detail was overlooked. With a final click, he sent the email, sealing Mary and Donald's fate. The reaction was swift and explosive. Within hours, the scandal broke across news channels and social media platforms. Headlines screamed of infidelity and betrayal, painting Donald as a villain and Mary as a willing accomplice. Journalists camped outside their homes, eager for any scrap of new information. The public, ever hungry for scandal, devoured every detail. Donald's political career was instantly derailed. The once charismatic figure was now a pariah, his supporters abandoning him in droves. His party distanced itself, issuing statements condemning his actions. His face, once a symbol of trust and leadership, became the subject of ridicule and outrage. The photos were plastered everywhere, a visual reminder of his fall from grace. Mary's life, too, was shattered. Friends and acquaintances turned their backs on her, whispers of her infidelity spreading like wildfire. She became the subject of cruel gossip and judgment, her respectable image crumbling under the weight of public scorn. Her phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters, her social media flooded with vitriol. The life she had known was gone, replaced by a nightmare of her own making. For a moment, George felt a sense of triumph. He had exposed the truth, and justice had been served. But the satisfaction was short-lived. Just when he thought he had won, an unexpected twist turned his plan on its head. Desperate to salvage his career and reputation, Donald fought back with everything he had. Donald held a press conference, his face a mask of controlled indignation. He denied the allegations, accusing George of fabricating the photos and blackmailing him. He painted himself as a victim of a vindictive husband, claiming that George had assaulted him and Mary in a fit of jealous rage. The media, always eager for a new angle, seized on the story. Mary, too, played her part. In a tearful interview, she claimed that George had coerced her into the affair, using threats and violence to control her. She portrayed herself as a victim, trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who had finally snapped. Her performance was convincing, and sympathy began to shift in her favor. George was blindsided. What had begun as a quest for justice had turned into a nightmare. The public, so quick to condemn Donald and Mary, now turned their scrutiny on him. He was portrayed as an unstable, vengeful husband who had gone too far. The legal system, too, became a battlefield. Donald and Mary filed charges of assault and blackmail, forcing George into a fight for his own freedom. The courtroom was a circus, media and spectators filling every seat. Lawyers on both sides presented their cases, each more dramatic than the last. George found himself on the defensive, his every action questioned and dissected. The photos he had taken, once his greatest weapon, were now being used against him as evidence of his supposed instability and malice. Friends and colleagues began to distance themselves, unsure of what to believe. Lily, caught in the middle of the storm, struggled to understand what was happening to her family. George's carefully laid plans were unraveling, and he realized that his quest for revenge had come at a great cost. Amid the chaos, George was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. He had set out to expose a betrayal, but in doing so, he had become entangled in a web of lies and deceit. The lines between right and wrong blurred, leaving him questioning whether his pursuit of justice had been worth the price he was now paying. As the trial continued, George fought to clear his name and regain his sense of self. He knew that whatever the outcome, his life would never be the same. The nuclear revenge he had unleashed had left a trail of destruction, one that he would have to navigate with whatever strength he had left. The courtroom was packed, a buzz of anticipation filling the air. Cameras flashed, and journalists scribbled furiously, eager to capture every detail of what had become the trial of the year. George sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of determination. He had hired the best legal team he could afford, knowing that his future hung in the balance. Beside him, his lead attorney, a seasoned litigator named Rebecca, whispered last-minute advice. The prosecution painted a damning picture. They portrayed George as a man driven by jealousy and rage, willing to go to any lengths to destroy those who had wronged him. They called witnesses who testified to his erratic behavior, trying to establish a pattern of instability. Donald and Mary took the stand, their performances Oscar-worthy. Donald spoke of threats and blackmail, his voice trembling with feigned fear. Mary, in a tearful display, recounted her supposed torment, painting George as a monster who had trapped her in a nightmare. Rebecca countered with a meticulous strategy. She presented the photos and videos George had taken, arguing that they were not the actions of a madman, but of a man seeking to expose a grave injustice. She called character witnesses who spoke of George's integrity and dedication as a father. Lily, though young, took the stand with a bravery that moved everyone. She spoke of her father's love and the pain she felt seeing her family torn apart. Public opinion was sharply divided. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, some holding signs of support for George, others condemning him as a villain. Social media buzzed with debates, hashtags trending as people took sides. The pressure was immense, but George remained resolute. He knew that the truth was on his side, and he trusted Rebecca to bring it to light. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day more grueling than the last. Through it all, George clung to the thought of Lily. She had been deeply affected by the scandal, her once bright eyes now shadowed with worry. He knew he had to be strong for her, even as his own world crumbled. He focused on their routines, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. They went to the park, watched movies, and did homework together. It was in these small moments that George found the strength to keep going. Rebecca's defense was relentless. She dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, exposing inconsistencies and highlighting the lack of concrete evidence against George. She argued that while his actions may have been extreme, they were driven by a profound sense of betrayal and a desire to protect his family. The jury listened intently, the weight of their responsibility evident on their faces. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood to deliver the jury's decision. We find the defendant, George Carter, not guilty on all charges. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a murmur of reactions. George exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a wave of relief washing over him. He turned to Rebecca, who gave him a reassuring nod. He had won the legal battle, but the war for his life was far from over. With the trial behind him, George focused on rebuilding. The media frenzy gradually died down, though the whispers and stares persisted. He returned to his job, finding solace in the routine and the support of colleagues who had stood by him. Difficult, and there were days when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. But slowly, bit by bit, they began to heal. George learned to let go of the anger that had consumed him, finding peace in the simple joys of life. He realized that while revenge had brought temporary satisfaction, it was love and resilience that would ultimately mend their fractured lives. As the months passed, the scars of the scandal began to fade. George and Lily built new memories, laying the foundation for a future free from the shadows of betrayal. And in those quiet moments, as they laughed together or shared a silent hug, George knew that they would be okay. They had survived the storm, and now they were ready to embrace the calm that followed. As the court case dragged on, the constant turmoil began to take its toll on George. He spent long nights lying awake, replaying every moment of the past few months. The anger that had driven him to seek revenge began to wane, replaced by a deep sense of sorrow and regret. He started to question his actions and the impact they had on everyone involved. It was during one of these sleepless nights that George made a decision. He needed to seek forgiveness. The first step was reaching out to those he had hurt, starting with Mary. Their marriage was beyond repair, but George hoped that by seeking her forgiveness, he could find some semblance of peace. He arranged to meet her in a neutral place, a small cafe that they used to frequent when they were first married. The familiarity of the setting brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. When Mary arrived, there was a palpable tension in the air. She looked weary, the weight of the scandal evident in her eyes. They sat in awkward silence for a few moments before George finally spoke. "Mary, I know I've done things that have hurt you," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I was angry and felt betrayed, and I let that anger control my actions. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused you." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "George, I never wanted things to end up this way. I'm sorry too. I made terrible choices, and I've paid the price for them." They talked for hours, laying bare their feelings and regrets. It was a painful but necessary conversation, one that allowed them to acknowledge their mistakes and begin the process of healing. Though their paths would now diverge, there was a mutual understanding that forgiveness was the first step towards finding peace. George also sought forgiveness from his friends and family, who had been dragged into the scandal through no fault of their own. He knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but he was committed to showing them that he was capable of change. In the end, George was cleared of most charges. The court recognized the mitigating circumstances and the emotional turmoil he had endured. The relief of the verdict was tempered by the realization that the experience had left deep scars. Donald, the once prominent politician, was not as fortunate. The scandal had irreparably damaged his career. He faced numerous charges related to his affair and was ultimately convicted of obstruction of justice for his false accusations against George. His fall from grace was swift and brutal, leaving him a shadow of his former self. Mary's life had also been irrevocably changed. She moved away from the town where everyone knew her name and her shame. Starting over was difficult, but she found a job in a different city and began to piece her life back together. The affair and its aftermath had cost her dearly, but it also gave her a chance to reflect and grow. For George, The road to healing was long and arduous. He focused on his daughter, Lily, who had been deeply affected by the ordeal. They spent more time together, finding solace in each other's company. George took her on trips, helped with her school projects, and made sure she knew she was loved and supported. They attended therapy sessions together and individually, working through their trauma and rebuilding their bond. Lily's resilience amazed George, and he drew strength from her determination to move forward. George also found new interests and hobbies to fill the void left by his broken marriage. He took up running, finding that the physical exertion helped clear his mind. He joined a local book club, rediscovering a love for literature that he had long neglected. Through these activities, he began to forge new connections and rebuild his sense of self. As the months turned into years, the pain of the past began to fade. George learned to let go of his anger and resentment, replacing them with acceptance and a desire for a better future. He dated occasionally, though cautiously, knowing that trust would take time to rebuild. One evening, as he and Lily sat on the porch watching the sunset, George felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. They talked about their hopes and dreams, about the future they were building together. In that moment, George knew that they had come through the storm stronger and more resilient. He vowed to continue moving forward, focusing on the love and happiness he shared with Lily. The journey had been painful, but it had also been a catalyst for growth and change. George was determined to make the most of his second chance, to live a life filled with meaning and purpose. The path to reconciliation had been difficult, but it had also led him to a place of newfound hope and possibility.